10:50 in the morning, 29th of November 2016. Salmon Street, Port Melbourne. The transfer line at the Fishermans Bend engine plant runs one last time. The block slides into final inspection. Engine number 1,137,282, a 3.6 litre V6, the last to be built on Australian soil. The laser etcher fires. 5 characters. Last, then a date. 29/11/16. The line stops. The siren that rang every morning since 1936 does not ring again. Across the country, in every garage from Cheltenham to Caringbah, in every TAFE workshop, in every restored FJ at every Sunday car club run, the inline 6 idle keeps idling. 68 years to the day earlier, on this same concrete floor, the Prime Minister of Australia put his hand on the bonnet of the first one. "She's a beauty," he said. "The country that built it didn't keep it." This story ends where it started. Chapter 1. The Father Who Wasn't There. He arrived in Australia in 1934 with an English accent, a Royal Naval Air Service record, a Vauxhall engineering background, and an Alfred Sloan handshake. Sir Lawrence John Hartnett, born 27th of May 1898 in Woking, Surrey. Father a small businessman, mother a housekeeper. Wartime aero engine fitter, post-war Vauxhall apprentice. A General Motors career that ran through Sweden, Germany and England, 6 countries in 15 years. When he became Managing Director of General Motors Holdens Limited in 1934, he was 36 years old. He inherited a company that assembled American car bodies in Australia. It did not make engines. It did not make cars. It rebolted Detroit. Hartnett wanted to make a car. He flew over Melbourne in a chartered plane in 1935. He looked at 18 industrial sites with a tape measure and a notebook. He picked Fishermans Bend, a flat, low swamp-edge tract of Yarra River frontage that locals colloquially called Siberia, a former golf course green, close to the wharves, close to the city, 86 acres of nothing. 23rd of February 1936. Premier Albert Dunstan turned the first sod. The land had cost the company £40,000, the Holden Retirees Club's record from Dunstan's 1935 cabinet announcement, though some later sources have placed the figure as high as £400,000. 11 months of construction. Plant 1, assembly, 30,000 square metres. Plant 2, body manufacture, administration. Parts. An Art Deco office block at the southern end of Salmon Street. The first car off the new line was an Oldsmobile. The man behind the wheel was John Story, General Motors Holden's general manager. Hartnett was in the passenger seat. The photograph survives. The factory siren had not yet been fitted. 5th of November, 1936. Prime Minister Joseph Lyons cut the ribbon in front of 1,500 guests. He spoke a line that would be quoted for the next 80 years. "There is nothing that Australians cannot attempt, and nothing that they will fail to do once they have made up their minds." Hartnett stood next to him. He would resign in 11 years. Here's the thing about Larry Hartnett. He was English-born. His salary came from Detroit. His pension came from Detroit. His promotions came from Detroit. But every time he opened his mouth in front of an Australian audience, what came out was Australian. He believed Australia could build its own car. He believed the Yarra River frontage at Fisherman's Bend could rival anything in Michigan. He believed Detroit agreed. He was wrong on the third point. Inside the General Motors building in New York, the executives who controlled Hartnett's career thought of the Australian operation as a colonial outpost, a test market, a pin in a map. The English engineer with the visionary speeches was useful for newspapers and ribbon cuttings and tariff negotiations. He was not useful for anything that cost real money. He picked the site, he built the plant, he pitched the engine, and he wasn't there when it launched. Chapter 2. The engine that came from Detroit. In 1944, with the Pacific War still on, Hartnett flew to New York to ask Alfred Sloan for a car. Sloan was chairman of General Motors. He was the most powerful industrial executive in America. He had built General Motors into the largest manufacturing corporation in human history. And when Hartnett laid the proposal on the table, a car designed for Australia, built in Australia, paid for partly by Australian government, Sloan looked across the desk and said something that ended up in 3 biographies. He called it a goddamn socialist setup. Sloan refused American capital. The Commonwealth Bank put up most of the £3 million required. The Bank of Adelaide put up the rest. $0 from Detroit. The car would be Australian on paper, Australian in funding, Australian on the dealer floor. But the engine would be designed in Detroit. Christmas, 1944. General Motors appointed Russell S. Begg chief engineer of the Australian car program. Begg was an American sent to Opel in Germany in 1934. At Opel, he had pioneered mass production monocoque construction. The 1935 Opel Olympia was the world's first mass-produced monocoque car. The 1938 Opel Kapitein was GM's first monocoque 6-cylinder. Begg knew engines. Begg knew light bodies. Begg was, as a colleague named Bill Abbott once described him, a fanatic for weight saving. Begg's program was already running before the Australian deal was approved. Internal designation, Project 195Y15, a small light monocoque 6-cylinder family car. There was also a 195Y13, a 4-cylinder variant. The board pitted them against each other in 1944. The 6 won decisively. So when General Motors said yes to Australia, the engineering work was 80% done. 3 prototypes were hand-built in Detroit through 1946. The first was registered on the 12th of February 1947 as a Chevrolet. Plate JP480, Michigan. That car is now in the National Museum of Australia. 2 more prototypes were built in Australia. One Australian engineer pushed for 9 inches of ground clearance for the Outback. His name was Jack Rawnsley. Begg agreed. The combination of Detroit weight discipline and Australian ground clearance made the 48-215 what every Australian would call the FX, a car that could survive a corrugated bush track at 60 miles an hour and run a city commute at 20. The engine inside it, the grey motor, was a 132 cubic inch overhead valve, straight 6, 60 brake horsepower at 3,800 RPM, 4 main bearings, pressurised lubrication, single Stromberg carburettor, painted grey. It was not Australia's first internal combustion engine. Ronaldson Tippett had been making industrial Australs in Ballarat since 1908. It was Australia's first mass-produced car engine. It was the engine that put Australia on wheels. And before it ever rolled off a production line, the man who built the plant to make it would be gone. Chapter 3. The Sovereignty Flaw. When Joseph Lyons opened the plant on the 5th of November 1936, he could not have known what it would build first. The first cars off the Salmon Street line in late September 1936 were Oldsmobiles, driven off by GMH General Manager John Story with Hartnett alongside. 3 years later, the flaw would convert to something else entirely. On the 3rd of September 1939, Australia declared war on Germany. By 1941, half of Fishermans Bend was building aircraft. The first product was the Wackett Trainer, a tandem-seat biplane used to train Royal Australian Air Force pilots. Fishermans Bend built the wings and tail assemblies. In 1942, a young woman named Joyce Breeden was photographed at her workstation by an Australian War Memorial cameraman. The caption, "An expert in setting brads ready for applying the skin to the wing frame of a Wackett Trainer. Her hands are on the brad press. She is wearing overalls." Then came the Beaufort. Fishermans Bend built the wing centre sections for the Bristol Beaufort bomber and ran one of 2 final assembly lines in the country. The other was at Mascot in Sydney. GM Holden's Woodville plant in South Australia built additional major assemblies. The Beaufort was the workhorse of the Pacific Air War. Fisherman's Bend turned out the part of it that held the engines. The engines themselves, de Havilland Gypsy Majors, were license-built on the same factory floor. Allison aero engines were overhauled on the same factory floor. Here is where the historical record gets confused and the script will not let it. Next door, on Lorimer Street, was the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, CAC. A separate company founded in 1935 by Essington Lewis of BHP, managed by Lawrence Wackett, the same Wackett whose biplane wings GMH was building. CAC built the Boomerang fighter, the Wirraway trainer, and license-built the Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasp radial engine. But CAC built the Twin Wasps at Lidcombe in New South Wales, not at Fisherman's Bend. GMH and CAC were neighbours and partners. Hartnett was a director of CAC from 1935 to 1947. But they were not the same plant. Read that again. They were not the same plant. GMH Fisherman's Bend also built 2-pounder and 6-pounder anti-tank guns. The 6-pounder program began in July 1941 and coordinated 254 separate subcontractors. It built 25-pounder gun howitzers. It built torpedoes and torpedo engines. It built bomb cases. By 1945, an estimated 80 to 90% of the plant's output was war material. In April 1947, with the war over, Hartnett resigned. He had been sidelined by GM since late 1946. Whether he was pushed or jumped depends on which biography you read. On the 29th of November 1948, 1,100 guests gathered in front of the Salmon Street plant. Prime Minister Ben Chifley placed his hand on the bonnet of the first 48-215, grey motor number 1001 inside it. "She's a beauty," he said. The empire began. Chapter 4. The engine that put Australia on wheels. Between the 29th of November 1948 and the 2nd of August 1963, the grey motor was Australia, not a metaphor, a literal sentence. The 48-215, the FX, sold faster than Holden could build them. By 1949, there was a 6-month waiting list. The FJ replaced the FX in 1953, then the FE in 1956, then the FC, the FB, the EK, the EJ, 7 body styles. One engine family. The grey motor, painted grey, 132 cubic inches, 60 brake horsepower. Single Stromberg carburettor, 4 main bearings, 3-speed column shift manual, optional roto hydromatic, automatic in the later cars. By the mid-1950s, 1 in 2 new cars sold in Australia was a Holden. The grey motor was in every TAFE mechanic's workshop. It was in every RAAF officers' club car park. It was in every wheat farmer's ute, from Cairns to Bunbury. It was the sound of a Sunday morning church drive. It was the idol that the country recognised the way Americans recognised a small block Chevy. The FE Holden, released in July 1956, brought a 12-volt electrical system and the first compression bump, output to 72 horsepower. By the time the grey was bored to 138 cubic inches for the FB in 1959, it made 75, tiny increments. The same engine, year after year. The factory at Salmon Street kept building it because the country kept buying it. In 1956, a Repco research engineer named Phil Irving decided the grey motor deserved more. Irving was an engineering polymath. He had designed Vincent motorcycles. He would later design the Repco Brabham FOF 8 that won Jack Brabham the 1966 Formula One World Championship. In 1956, he sat at a drawing board in Melbourne and designed a 12-port crossflow cast iron head for the Holden Grey. He called it the Repco High Power. It was a complete bolt-on kit. Some sources put the price at £150, others at £167. Properly tuned, the Repco headed grey made between 90 and 150 brake horsepower, 2.5 times the standard engine. Then a man named Merv Waggett in Greenacre, Sydney, did something genuinely insane. Waggett Engineering built a twin overhead camshaft aluminium head for the grey motor. Only 6 to 9 of them ever existed. Output 220 brake horsepower, 3.6 times the original. Between 1952 and 1962, the 2,160 cubic centimetre grey motor powered no fewer than 25 entries in the Australian Grand Prix. Only 2 Australian Grand Prix in those 11 years did not have at least one grey motor on the entry list. Jack Myers in the WM with the Waggett twin cam. Dud Dancy in the Dunstan rotary valve special. Sports cars, racing boats, hydroplanes, midgets, drag cars, hill climbers. In August 1963, the E.H. Holden launched. In 18 months, Holden sold 256,959 E.H. models. The company's own claim, the fastest-selling Australian car of all time. It was the peak of the grey motor era. The last grey motor was built on the 2nd of August 1963. And inside General Motors in Detroit, men with calculators were beginning to wonder why the colonial outpost needed to build its own engines at all. Chapter 5. The Cost of the Boom. By 1964, General Motors Holdens employed 23,914 Australians nationally. The Fishermans Bend plant ran 3 shifts. Salmon Street at 6 in the morning was lit like a city. By 1966, the plant had its own social club with a 500-seat theatrette, a medical centre, a canteen, a common room, and a mural cycle painted by General Motors Holden's own resident artist, Eileen Robertson, depicting the progress of transport from sailing ship to space rocket. The men and women who built the engines were mostly born somewhere else. Italian foundrymen from Calabria worked the casting floor. Greek machinists from Lefkada ran the boring lines. Yugoslav and Maltese fitters worked the assembly. Vietnamese workers came in the 80s. They lived in Port Melbourne and South Melbourne and Footscray and Sunshine. Their children walked to school past the plant gates. The Yarra River air carried the foundry smell 3 suburbs east. By the late 1960s, the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union represented most of the floor. They had won shift loadings, holiday pay, and a medical centre. They had not won the right to be told when the plant would close. Here's the kicker. In 1950, a man named Bob Chamberlain, founder of Chamberlain Tractors in Western Australia, the same Bob Chamberlain whose family owned Rolloy Piston Company in Port Melbourne, looked at the pre-production grey motor and gave a verdict to a Repco engineer named John Cummins. "It's a terrible engine," he said. "You'll never get any decent horsepower out of it." Read that again. The man who said that supplied every single piston in every single grey motor ever built. His family's company cast them. His family's company shipped them up Salmon Street. His family's company invoiced General Motors Holdens for 15 years. And Bob Chamberlain was wrong. Phil Irving's Repco High Power proved him wrong by 1956. Merv Waggett's twin cam proved him wrong by 1958 at 220 brake horsepower. The Australian Grand Prix grid proved him wrong 25 times between 1952 and 1962. The Australian engineering hand, Irving, Waggett, Jack Myers, Dud Dancy, took an American Detroit design and made it sing in a way Russell Begg never imagined. Let that number sit for a moment. 3.6 times the original output. Australian backyards, Australian engineers, American block. The cost was paid in lungs and ears and joints. The casting floor temperature hit 50 degrees Celsius in summer. The drop forge hammer ran through 3 shifts. The chrome plating tanks at the components plant were the kind of hexavalent chromium bath that Erin Brockovich would later become famous fighting in California. Nobody measured chromium exposure at Fishermans Bend before the late 1970s. Men retired with shaking hands they were told was just the way fitters' hands ended up. By 1973, the country that built the grey motor was about to be told it couldn't afford to. Before we get to what Detroit did, hit subscribe. Because what happens in the next 6 chapters is the part of this story Holden never wanted on video. It's the part where the company that put Australia on wheels watched 4 governments, 3 Detroit executives and 1 imported V6 take it apart, screw by screw. The Akerson decision is coming. The hockey quote is coming. The factory siren goes silent in Chapter 10. Subscribe before you scroll. The dismantling starts now. Chapter 6. The Whitlam Cut. On the 18th of July 1973, at 7 o'clock in the evening, the Prime Minister of Australia walked into the House of Representatives and cut every tariff in the country by 25% overnight. Garth Whitlam, 3 years into government, no legislation, no phase-in, cabinet decision, executive action, gazetted the next morning. The Treasurer was Frank Crean. The unions had not been consulted. The manufacturers had not been warned. The vehicle tariff dropped from 45% to 33%. The car industry, the industry Hartnett had pleaded into existence in 1944, the industry the Lyons government had subsidised in 1936, woke up on the 19th of July with a hole in its wall. General Motors Holdens responded the way a multinational responds. Within months, the company sacked 5,000 Australian workers. The Elizabeth plant went to a single shift. The Pagewood plant in Sydney closed entirely in 1980. Bob Hawke, then President of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, not yet a Prime Minister, but already the most powerful Labor voice in the country, walked into the Cabinet room and forced a revision. A local content quota. A bipartisan import replacement program. Hawke saved Holden from itself, briefly. But the damage to the industry's faith in continuity was permanent. Across the country, 138,000 manufacturing jobs disappeared in the years following the Whitlam cut. The vehicle tariff would never go back up, but the red motor era was already at its peak. The 149 cubic inch and 179 cubic inch red motors that had replaced the grey from August in '63 were a quantum leap. 7 main bearings, hydraulic lifters, oil filter, over square dimensions. The 186 and 202 cubic inch versions arrived through the 60s. Holden put the 202 in the LJ Torana GTR XU1. 3 Stromberg carburetors, a roll cage, a 27-year-old kid from Hurstbridge named Peter Brock. On the 1st of October 1972, Brock won the Bathurst 500 solo in an XU1, the first 6-cylinder Bathurst victory in history. Read that again. The first time a 6-1 Bathurst. Not repeated until a Nissan Skyline GTR 19 years later. Brock drove the entire race himself. It was the last year solo driving was permitted at Mount Panorama. The last year the race was 500 miles before it became the 1,000. The Australian red motor won Bathurst. And 6 years later, inside General Motors, a committee in Warren, Michigan, decided the engine that would replace the red motor in the next generation small car would not be Australian at all. The Camera was coming. The Camera would use a Detroit-designed 1.6-litre 4-cylinder called the Family 2. The Family 2 would be built at Fishermans Bend starting in 1981, the first foreign-designed engine on the Australian floor since the Allison Aero engines of 1942. The Australian engineering bench would not be asked. Chapter 7. The Family 2. In 1978, an engineering committee inside the General Motors Technical Centre in Warren, Michigan, decided the next generation small car, global designation the T-Car family, would carry a single shared engine across all GM divisions: Opel, Vauxhall, Holden, Chevrolet, one four-cylinder, one toolset, one supply chain. The family too. The decision was framed as efficiency. The cost was Australia. 3 years later, in 1981, Family 2 production began at Fishermans Bend. For the first time since 1942, when GMH had licence built de Havilland Gypsy motor aero engines for the war effort, the Salmon Street factory was building an engine designed by foreigners. The grey motor had been designed in Detroit by Russell Begg too, of course. But the Australian engineering hand of Phil Irving and Merv Waggett and Jack Rawnsley had made it Australian in everything except its birthplace. The Family 2 would never get that. It was a global engine on a global plan. The red motor went into its last years through 1979 and 1980. The blue motor, emissions-tuned, lower compression, slightly less powerful, ran from 1980 to 1984. The black motor, the final inline 6, ran from 1984 to 1986. Each evolution was a holding pattern. Each evolution was the engineering team trying to keep an old man alive on the operating table. On the 30th of May 1984, Senator John Button announced the Motor Industry Plan. The vehicle tariff would phase down from 57.5% toward 15% by the year 2000. 5 model platforms would be consolidated into 3. Manufacturers would be forced into shared programs and badge engineering. The Button Plan was rational. The Button Plan was inevitable. The Button Plan was the second pillar of the Whitlam Cut, 11 years late. Inside the Fisherman's Bend foundry, the inline 6 dynasty was running out of calendar. The last black motor came off the line in 1986. 38 years of continuous Australian inline 6 production ended in a workshop on Salmon Street with no ceremony, no press release, no Prime Minister, no 1100 VIPS. That same year, in Cremorne, Sydney, Sir Lawrence Hartnett died at the age of 87. He had spent his last 35 years writing books about what Australian manufacturing could have been if Detroit had let it. His Hartnett car, a small front-wheel drive runabout he had built after resigning from General Motors, had failed commercially in the early 1950s. He had then pioneered the Australian importation of Datsun and other Japanese vehicles. He was made Knight Bachelor in 1967. He died in 1986, the same year the last black motor came off the line. The man who picked the site and built the plant and pitched the engine left in the same calendar year as the engine family he had spent 40 years arguing for. He had not been there when it launched. He was not there when it died. Chapter 8. The Buick V6 in August 1988. The engine that replaced the black motor came from Buick. On the 17th of August 1988, Holden released the VN Commodore, bigger than the VL. Wider tracks, a new look, and under the bonnet, for the first time in 15 years, a 6-cylinder engine that was not Japanese. The new engine was the Buick 3.8-litre LN3 V6. It was American. It was imported initially, then locally manufactured at Fisherman's Bend from 1995. It would power the Commodore, Australia's best-selling family car, until 2009, with supercharged variants running to 2010 and Holden's locally machined Ecotec and Alloytec V6s descending from the same architecture all the way to the 29th of November 2016. And this is where it gets genuinely insane. The Buick V6 was descended directly from the Buick 215 aluminium V8 that General Motors had developed in 1961. That same Buick 215 was the block that Phil Irving, yes, the same Phil Irving who designed the Repco high power head for the Australian grey motor in 1956, adopted in 1965 to build the Repco Brabham 620 V8. The Repco Brabham V8 won Jack Brabham the 1966 Formula One World Championship and the constructor's title in the same year. It is the single greatest Australian motorsport engineering. Triumph in history. Phil Irving won an F1 title with a Buick block. The Buick block, same engine family, evolved one generation, killed Holden's inline-six dynasty in 1988. Read that again. Same engine architecture. Two stories, one Australian triumph, one Australian tragedy. Same factory floor, 3 decades apart. Around the time the Buick V6 entered Holden, the Hawke-Keating government accelerated the Button Plan. Tariffs went from 57.5% down to 45% in 1988, on the way to 25% by the year 2000. Local content requirements were stripped. By the early 90s, importing complete cars became cheaper than building them locally for the first time in 50 years. In 2000, the Howard government finalised the Button Plan. The tariff hit 15% and stopped there. 2 of the 4 Australian headquartered manufacturers, Mitsubishi and Ford, would be in terminal decline within 8 years. Holden would last 7 more. The Buick V6 was, by most contemporary industry assessments, less refined than the Nissan RB30e inline Sykes it replaced in the Commodore lineup. The Nissan unit had been Japanese imported. Currency movements made it uneconomic. Holden could have invested in a redeveloped local inline 6. Holden did not. The country that adopted an American engine in 1948 imported another in 1988 and forgot how to design its own. Phil Irving died in 1992, aged 89. He had lived long enough to see the Buick V6 replace the inline 6 he had once tripled the output of. Motorsport Australia today awards the Phil Irving Award, the country's highest engineering honour for motorsport. The block under that award traces back through Buick, through Detroit, through the same factory family that ended Holden. The grey motor era had run 38 years. The Buick era would run 28. In December 2013, on the 10th, in Detroit, a man named Dan Akerson would read a statement. Chapter 9. The Akerson Decision. Tuesday, the 10th of December 2013, 12:45 in the afternoon, Detroit time, 4:45 in the morning, Australian Eastern. General Motors Chairman and Chief Executive Daniel F. Akerson issued a statement to the wire services. We have decided that we will discontinue vehicle and engine manufacturing and significantly reduce our engineering operations in Australia by the end of 2017. The statement called the decision necessary, given what Akerson described as the perfect storm of negative influences, the sustained strength of the Australian dollar, the high cost of production, the small domestic market, and what he called, arguably, the most competitive and fragmented automotive market in the world. Approximately 2,900 positions would be impacted over the next 4 years. Around 1,600 from the Elizabeth Vehicle Assembly Plant in South Australia. Around 1,300 from Holden's Victorian operations, including the Fishermans Bend engine plant. Mike Devereaux, then Managing Director of GMH Australia, communicated the decision to the local workforce that morning. 2 years later, at the January 2015 Detroit Auto Show, GM Vice President for International Operations Stefan Jacoby told a small group of journalists in an off-the-cuff briefing captured on the record that the decision had been his. He said, "I was the one who decided to stop production in Australia." Here's the part most Australians have never been told. 4 days before Akerson's statement, on the 6th of December 2013, Treasurer Joe Hockey stood at the dispatch box in the House of Representatives and addressed General Motors directly. Either you're here or you're not. Prime Minister Tony Abbott followed up the same week. There would be no extra money over and above the support taxpayers had already given the motor industry. Holden had asked for an additional $265 million on top of the $275 million already committed by federal and state governments. The request was refused. Whether the Abbott-Hockey position caused the decision or merely triggered the announcement of one already made, is a matter of dispute. General Motors had been signalling for 2 years that Australian production was uneconomic. Holden's domestic sales had fallen from over 130,000 cars in 2007 to under 86,000 in 2013. The Australian dollar had been above parity with the US dollar for 30 months. Industry analysts later argued, some still argue, that even $400 million in additional support would not have moved the calculus inside Warren, Michigan. Others argued it would have. What is not disputed is what happened next. The Akerson decision triggered a domino. Ford had announced its own Australian exit 5 months earlier, with Geelong and Broadmeadows closing in October 2016. Toyota announced its closure 2 months after Holden, with Altona closing in October 2017. The Australian automotive manufacturing industry, built around the Yarra River factory floor on Salmon Street starting in 1936, would be entirely gone within 46 months. 3 years later, same plant, same floor, same date, 68 years to the day. Chapter 10. The 29th of November 2016. Tuesday morning, Salmon Street, Port Melbourne. The 175 workers still employed at the Fishermans Bend engine plant arrived for their final shift at 5:30. Some had been at GMH since the 1970s. Some had walked through the same gate every working day for 41 years. The clocking on machines registered each of them for the last time. The plant ran its standard pre-shift safety briefing in the social club building under Eileen Robertson's murals. The Yarra carried the foundry smell 3 suburbs east, 1 last time. At 10:50 in the morning, engine number 1,137,282, a 3.6 litre HFV6, the last of its kind, the last Holden engine ever built, slid into final inspection. A laser etcher fired. 5 characters across the block. Last. A date? 29/11/16. Some early reports from the floor put the moment earlier, 10:35 a.m., others later, close to 11. Industry Trade Press copied the date stamp as 29/11/17, and the typo propagated for years. The engine itself was etched 29/11/16. It was 2016. The block was lifted from the line and carried by hand to a fenced section of the floor. The press was not invited. Mark Bernhard, then chairman and managing director of GMH, addressed the workforce. While it was an emotional time to see the last engine built today, he said, "We are proud to retain a significant presence in Australia for the long term." Richard Phillips, manufacturing director, who had started at GAH in 1987 as an apprentice fitter and machinist, 29 years before he watched the last engine leave, told the room that the workers had made an enormous contribution to the company and to the entire Australian motoring industry. The plant had, earlier in 2016, won the General Motors International Most Valuable Plant for Productivity Award. It closed the same year it won the award. The numbers: 1,137,282 HFV6s in 13 years of production. 699,806 of them went into Australian-built Commodores and Statesmen and Caprices. 437,436 were exported into right-hand drive Vauxhalls and Chevrolet Camaros and Pontiac G8s. The plant had run a peak capacity of 960 engines per day across 2 shifts on the $300 million HFV 6 line opened in 2003. On the 29th of November 2016, it ran 1. Of the 230 jobs lost, 175 were made redundant on the day. 57 had already taken voluntary separation packages earlier in the year. Of those who took the voluntary packages, 80% had secured other employment by the day of closure. The remainder were retiring or had not sought further work. A staff lunch was held in the social club building under Eileen Robertson's murals. Commemorative gifts, a small framed photograph of the engine plant with the date stamp, were distributed. Engine number 1,137,282 was set aside for the Holden Heritage Collection. The plant siren did not ring at the end of the shift. Walk down Salmon Street today and the gates are still there. What stands behind them is not. Chapter 11. What the 29th of November built. Stand on the corner of Salmon Street and Todd Road, Port Melbourne, today. The Art Deco administration building at 251 to 261 Salmon Street still stands, sold to Altis Property Partners in April 2014 for $28.25 million. Leased back briefly to Holden, then converted to office tenants. The 1945 social centre, where the workers used to eat their canteen lunch under Eileen Robertson's murals of the progress of transport, is fenced off and slated to become the heritage heart of the Fishermans Bend renewal precinct, planned for 80,000 residents and 80,000 jobs by 2050. The University of Melbourne bought 7.2 hectares of the site in 2018 for an engineering campus, paid $49.8 million. And paused the project indefinitely in September 2025. The Victorian government, which acquired the rest of the 32-hectare site for around $130 million, has not yet decided what to do with it. No engine has been made on this floor since 10:50 in the morning, the 29th of November, 2016. Lesson 1. The engine was always American. Russell Begg designed the grey motor in Detroit in 1944. The Australian engineering hand of Phil Irving, Merv Waggett and Jack Rawnsley made it Australian in everything except its birthplace. When Detroit decided in 1978 to replace it with the Family 2.4 and in 1988 to replace its successor with the Buick V6 and in 2013 to end production altogether, Australia had no engineering bench left to argue. Lesson 2. Sovereignty flaws don't survive economic rationalism. The same factory floor that built Buford bomber wing centre sections in 1942 built the grey motor in 1948 and the HFV6 in 2016. The plant survived a depression and 2 world wars. It did not survive Whitlam's 1973 tariff cut, Hawke's 1988 acceleration, Howard's 2000 finalisation, and Joe Hockey's either you are here or you are not. The country built the floor for sovereignty. The country withdrew the protection for ideology. Lesson 3. The brand stayed. The country didn't. Holden the Markle was retired by General Motors in 2021. The original Detroit prototype, registered as a Chevrolet on the 12th of February 1947, is in the National Museum of Australia. Engine number 1,137,282 is in Holden's Heritage Collection. The country that built the engine that put it on wheels stood by and let Detroit decide when to stop building it. A grey motor idles in a restored 1953 FJ at an FXFJ club run on Albert Park Drive, the first Sunday of next month, 2026. Two-tone paint. The unmistakable inline 6 idle. The owner is the grandson of the man who fitted the Repco high power head in 1956. The engine was designed in Detroit. It was built on Salmon Street. It was tuned in Greenacre. It is idling today in a backyard in Cheltenham. The country that built it is somewhere else.